Okay, what's up, YouTube? This is the first video of any kind that I've done since May. I used to do a lot of these. Um, I used to do one every single day for the first half of the lockdown. I used to do intense examination from a very uh, layman point of view, let's call it, because not everybody who is a consumer of news is going to be able to analyze it from the perspective of a statistician or an historian or a person with a impressive college education. There's a lot of people out there. Most of the people that I have encountered in life have been people whose primary goal was to secure their future and their lives and their own sense of happiness and meaning and all that. And so the events of the day affect them just as much as they would affect anybody else, including the kind of people who you see as professional broadcasters who are able to give this incisive, insightful commentary with all the appropriate historical context and blah blah blah. And it's not as though the only reason news exists is for the benefit of such people. It affects us all, including those of us who cannot boast of some kind of impressive educational or academic accomplishment. And that's very much where I'm at. I did it every single day. I was looking at stats of coronavirus cases, of coronavirus deaths, of the various attempts to develop medication and vaccine. I was doing everything that I was able to think of. Uh, and then George Floyd happened. And that threw a dimension across this entire year that changed everything, as though 2020 was not already horrendous enough. That event and everything that happened afterward was beyond the pale in so many ways. And I didn't feel like I wanted to just continue going on Facebook where I did all those videos, all those live videos, and start talking about that and start talking about George Floyd because, nobody wants to experience the consequences of uttering an unapproved opinion on social media. Try as you might, no one can honestly and realistically claim that they're impervious to being ganged up upon by a bunch of angry anonymous assholes on Facebook or Twitter. No one wants to go through that. So I just stopped and I decided it was a time to observe and to watch and to experience and just withhold comment for the moment, especially considering that I'm not on the side of most political commentators on social media. I am not a leftist. And that is what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about why I am not a leftist. I'm also not a right wing identitarian bigot racist. I'm not comfortable in any political party, and I don't make any effort to identify with any political party, and I have always been that way. But most of the people by whom I have been surrounded intentionally, the people by whom I have surrounded myself have been very much leftist, and that's where I felt the most comfortable when I was younger. I am an openly gay, pro marijuana rock musician. Whether I've gotten big and famous or not, which I haven't, that's the area of endeavor to which I have committed my life. And so most of the people by whom I have been surrounded, with whom I have worked, and uh, whose creative input has affected and influenced my life the most have been hardcore leftists. And so why am I not like them? since I have devoted so much of my activity and so much of my creativity to collaborating with their minds and with their spirits. Why am I not like them? That's that's what I want to talk about today. A central tenet of leftist philosophy is to stand in vehement opposition to prejudice. And that is a very correct philosophy, because prejudice can cause, and has proven that it will cause, untold human suffering and damage in many, many ways. From the subtle to the gross, it's evident the potential for damage and pain that prejudice can cause. Why is it then that no one wants to acknowledge the prejudice of the left? Why do people not call them out for their hypocrisy when they stand before the world and declare themselves to be the only good in this world? That only they are qualified to speak on the direction in which our civilization will advance. Leftist prejudice. I draw upon my lived experience. I draw upon what I know because I've seen it and experienced it. And isn't it interesting that when we talk, or more specifically, when we hear leftists talk about social justice and all other similar topics, that it needs to be something that is removed from them by great distance, by anonymity, and by large expanses of time. Go back to the founding of this country and talk about how fucked up and evil it all is. Or watch a television of a city hundreds or thousands of miles away in flames. That is the target and focus of the attention of your average leftist. But when it comes to something that's happening within their immediate sphere, their immediate life, it's just too close and too awkward, and people tense up and want to change the subject. If acting on behalf of social justice requires them to take sides in a dispute with deep moral implications, but that happens to be taking place between people that they know, all of a sudden this is no longer a conversation worth having. I don't know. But my lived experience with leftist prejudice, I hear people make a lot of ugly comments about geographical regions of the country. I went to a birthday party in Olympia, and this girl who was there, I asked her where she was from, and she said that she was from a town, I think she said Longview, somewhere, I think, in like southwestern Washington state. And I didn't know where it was. I was unfamiliar with it. And then she kind of looked sideways at me like it was strange that I was not familiar with the place. And so she asked where I was from. And when I told her I was from the Midwest, she goes, "Oh." And I just kind of looked at her like, "What do you mean by that?" And immediately she went into this weird mixture of defensiveness and mockery. Like she had to put forth this facade like she was apologizing for her reaction, but she also had to make sure that I was aware that she meant that initial reaction, that she was not really going to genuinely and sincerely walk back her ridicule because it was too important to her. These preconceptions that she held were too important to her identity to really surrender them. So, my grandmother, on my father's side, her name was Eugenia Linnell. Her maiden name was Miller. She was the youngest of 8 children. She was raised in extremely impoverished conditions in rural central Mississippi, somewhere north of Jackson and south of Yazoo City. I've never been there. I've read about these places a lot. My grandmother wrote an autobiography that she passed down to us that was a wealth of vital knowledge. Her mother, so my great-grandmother, who was born sometime in the late 19th century, was a very forward-thinking, decent Southern woman. With respect to race relations from that time, a century ago, in the very deep South, my great-grandmother forbade the use of the N-word in her home and in her family. The black folks who lived with them in the same town, the same community, were simply accepted as people who attended different churches and who attended different schools. They were a group of human beings who were neither hated nor feared, and the youngsters of both ethnicities played together as equals in the dusty streets and alleys and in the outdoors. Again, to emphasize, a poor white woman raising a family of 8 children in a rural farm setting in central Mississippi a century ago explicitly forbade discriminatory conduct and the use of racial slurs in her home. These are values that she passed down to each of those 8 children, the youngest of whom was my grandmother. Those values were then passed down to my father and to my aunt, to me. These are my Southern roots. And of these roots, I'm quite proud. My father, and his father before him, from the same side of the family as Eugenia, both served our nation in the Air Force. Granddaddy, as he was called, was a World War II veteran in the Air Force. And my father graduated from the Air Force Academy in 1973, devoting his entire life to a career serving our country, first 14 years in the Air Force, then he moved on to civil service with Department of Defense and then the Iowa Air National Guard. The military is an enormous part of my family, my life, my upbringing. I did not serve myself for various reasons. My mother graduated from Emmaus Bible College. Both my parents identify as devout Christians. I do not. Certainly not in the terms and parameters by which they define their morality. I most certainly experienced bitter differences with both of my parents on a variety of social and moral issues. And I rebelled. In my early 20s, my late teens and my early 20s, I was a big fan of Bill Maher and of Michael Moore and other people, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Noam Chomsky. And like I mentioned before, I surrounded myself as much as I could with rock musicians and metal musicians. I smoked a lot of pot. I experimented with various drugs. And I spoke vociferously against the dogmatic prejudices of the moral perspectives of the right wing. But as I began to grow even just a little bit older, even just into my early to mid 20s, I began to detect a great deal of hypocrisy within my left leaning social set. Frequently, I began to overhear vicious and slanderous labels broadly applied to people of faith, to members of the armed services, against America as a nation, and especially against people in the South. And while I most certainly, again, had my own differences with Christianity and with right wing morality, the things that I heard being said were simply untrue. They were counterfactual. Things like the only reason that anyone would ever choose a career in the military is because they just wanted to devote their lives to murder, to the murder of foreigners and people of different races, and get away with it. That was the only reason anybody possibly could choose a career in the military, not 4 years and then just get out. I heard this said in public, in a crowded bar, and everyone around nodded in eager approval. Untrue. I heard people say that all Christians were anti-science morons who didn't even believe that dinosaurs existed. Again, I heard this, I think, in a break room at this job where I worked at a company that printed punk rock t-shirts. And this was said loudly amongst a group of my coworkers. No one disagreed with it. And I heard people make all kinds of slanderous comments about Southerners, that all Southerners were inbred, unsophisticated, racist hayseeds who only exist to be mocked. Have you guys noticed anytime somebody wishes to make someone sound unintelligent, they just affect a Southern accent? I hated hearing all of it. I was still trying to be, part of that group of people. I thought that it was required of me if I wanted to have any chance of succeeding in rock music. But as I grew into my late 20s, I began to openly object to and call out these kinds of characterizations if I heard someone utter them publicly. And why shouldn't I? I was speaking my truth, right? But the reaction I got whenever I did this was anything but open-minded, anything but tolerant, anything but receptive. I found myself being routinely shunned and laughed out of polite conversations for daring to speak up. And the anger and indignation that I detected in the eyes of these people was very revealing. As if to say, how dare you disagree with my insulting ridicule of people from the South or of Christians? How dare you disagree? Even though I'm simply standing up saying, hey, what you just said about career military people, you're talking about my father. You're talking about my mom as a Christian when you make these slanderous statements against all Christians. I'm going to I have my own bitter differences with my parents, but what you just said was factually wrong. But they wouldn't hear a syllable of it. How dare you disagree with the hate that I express against all people living south of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi River? How dare you? And the unabashed glee with which they clung to these obscene misconceptions and broad generalizations appeared to me as nothing less than willful prejudice. And it became very clear to me, especially when I left my hometown of Omaha and moved to where I live now and where I have lived for 7.5 years, Tacoma, Washington. It became very clear, very fast, that while I still find myself to this day at odds with many right-wing moral and social stances, that the solution could not be to simply follow the self-righteous utterances of a bunch of virtue-signaling moral narcissists whose idea of progress is to emulate the very behaviors that they condemn. Again, leftists want to stand proudly before the world and declare themselves to be the only good in this world, and that everyone else is either a threat or just an unfortunate fading memory of evolution. The more violent the demonstrations and the uprisings get, the more these thoughts that I have shared tonight are confirmed and reinforced. And I know that not concealing my point of view, no matter how well justified I can articulate it, it puts me in a certain degree of peril. Knowing that there are these roving bands of anarchists who would bully me into frightened silence. But that silence is not a sustainable state in which to live a fulfilling life, even if the cost may be great. I think I'm just going to end it there for tonight. Thank you.